That's what class is. We're here to have fun.
Yay!
All right. Today we're going to work through chapter 7 and also chapter 8. So we're going to start off on chapter 7, dealing with composition. So we went through and we did the spontaneous composition. That's going to be just a method that we can use to create a composition. But we're going to look at the fundamentals of composition, begin to grasp how to kind of work with the illusion of spatial depth. So what is it that we can do with that? The importance of grouping. So when we go through, we start to assign or have objects, how we put the information together. And we'll talk a little bit more about that even when we get into chapter 8 when we start dealing with chunking. And understand the compositional process. So what is it you're going to go through? Remember we talk about process all the time. And with that, you're going to see that what you do as a process isn't going to be the same as everybody else. Become more aware of what are you composing. So are you composing things for a single static surface? Are we starting to deal with composing things that are going to have interactive elements to them? Things along those lines. Grasp the role of type and image arrangements and also their relationships. And lastly, kind of look at and understand how we have an entry point into all of our designs. So how do you get into it? How do you keep people interested in what is there? So we start looking at composition. This is the form. So we look at the overall spatial properties and structure that you have inside of the design. What we're doing is we're going to go ahead and we're going to build this by how we go in and arrange all of the graphic elements that are inside of it. Remember, when we start talking about graphic elements, we're talking about two things. We're talking about type and images. So anytime you're designing stuff, we're dealing with type and images. How are you using each of those? What is the relationship of them to one another? And then also, what is the relationship to those objects and the format that you've chosen to go through and present it? Remember, what we're doing here is we're visually communicating with our audience, the intended audience that is there. Now we go and we start talking about composing. How is it we're actually putting those things into there? So what is the overall visual organization that we've created? As we go through, we start to think about how we're using that. Remember, type, as we build type has a density to it. Once we deal with the type creates an image based upon how we deal with everything from kerning, tracking, leading, even then the typeface that's selected, we start to get a density of what is there. So we go through and we start with any of our designs. We have to begin always with the margins. What do we have as the margins? So we start talking about the margins. That's the blank space that we're leaving on the left, top, right, and bottom. Is it possible for us to go through and allow things to go all the way up to page? Yes. We start talking about partial bleeds and full bleeds. Full bleed meaning that the ink goes off all of the edges. Then we go through and we start to think about how do we want to have these work. Remember that everything we're designing, everything we're using is in relation to those margins. As you start to work, as we get into chapter 8 again, we'll talk about grids. Start dealing with grids. What's going to happen with that? Is it a reflective grid or does it repeat page to page? So what's going to happen with that? Margins we go through, we start dealing with printed. Of course, we're dealing with the white part of the page. We go and we start getting into digital. You need to be aware of what's going to happen when this actually moves from being a printed composition, printed design, and moves over into a digital design. And because all of our displays are different, we go through, we start transmitting this onto some sort of a TV screen-ish setup. What you have then is overscan, so how much space do you need to leave on there as we go in and begin to use that. So as we go through, we start to look at it. Margins are going to play into the content. How large are the margins in relation to the content? As we go through and start to think about looking at proportions. You can set your margins proportional to the page. So they're going to end up being 10% of the page. When we go through and we start to think about what the margins are. Now it goes in here and talks about how is the white space that we're going to have around it going to increase readability. The other thing we start to look at is even color choices. Do you choose to have white? Do you choose to have black? Start taking photographs have a photograph mounted on a whiteboard, mounted on a blackboard, and put them up, and they're going to be perceived a little bit differently. Mainly because as we start dealing with the black and white, it's going to help with the contrast as we go through and start to look at the designs and the colors that are inside of them. As we go through, we start thinking about how are we working with those margins. As we go through and begin to use those margins, we start to provide harmony. Now, we talk about harmony in a lot of different ways in design. Harmony in the sense as we go through and we start to look at things, how do we pace through them? Balance, we've seen equal things, how we divided up our page, we start thinking about composition. Is it symmetrical? Is it not? Why? And then we get into stability, and I had one instructor who always talked about stability. It always is, you go through and start to look at it, where would you put the tack in the design so that the design would actually be balanced? It would sit there and be stable. You do too much in one side, wants to fall off the page. So start thinking about on those margins, just like with your designs, symmetry, asymmetry. Do you want consistent margins? Half-inch margins all the way around. We want a larger left margin, larger right margin. How is this going to work when we start getting into printed publications? There's going to be a difference when we go in there. If we have a large left margin and it gets placed on the left page, that means that your design is going to be closer to your center fold, to the gutter there of the page. So start to think about how is that going to go into your designs as you build them. Now we get into the format. We start talking about the format. This is how we're actually going to share it out. Are we talking about a single static print, a rectangular print? Are we thinking about going in and creating a design that has a die cut to it? Meaning it's cut to a shape. But as we start to think about it, how is it going to look across all of the media channels? Now most of the stuff we go and we start getting to digital. What's the shape of all of our digital screens? Rectangles. So, and that really plays itself off of the old printed page. We worked always in rectangles, rectangles, rectangles. So as you go through and you start to design, know that that's where it's most likely going to go. But the other thing we have on there is the aspect ratios are different. What is the width to the height? Things are starting to get a little bit more refined and consistent in the sense that a lot of stuff is going in that 16:9 format, but they're not all set that way at this point. Just looking at the two screens in front of you, you can see that they don't share the same aspect ratio. So as we go through, we start to think about that. What's going to happen with the width, the height? What is the shape of the pixels? Most of your pixels are going to be set and you're going to design them as squares. But there are pixel formats or design formats when we get into digital that will actually change what that ratio is for the pixel size. So keep that in mind as you go through and use it. It's important as you go through and start to work with digital formats and creating stuff that's going to be presented digital is to test it out on a screen that matches up with the one that you're actually going to be putting it on. Is that always possible? No. That's where we go when we talk about that overscan in the sense that it's ultimately going to scale up your design to fit onto the screen in which you are presenting it. As we go through and we start to work with it, think about how you're arranging the elements, and we're always going to be working with the outermost boundaries of any printed or digital page. So when we go and we start talking about action safe and title safe areas in digital design. So when we start working with video, start working with multimedia, we want to go in and set it up so that we know where that action safe, it's the area we want to keep stuff inside of, so that when it overscans we don't lose it. In title safe, that we go and we start dealing with text, making sure that text does not disappear from there. If we have a little bit of the action that is missing, it's not going to be the end of the world. If we're missing text where we can't read it, we're going to have a little bit of a problem. And then also start to think about the orientation. Now we start dealing with TVs, what's our natural orientation we think of?
Horizontal?
Landscape. So horizontal nature. Landscape is the main way we start thinking about things that are going to go in and work from a digital standpoint. But can we also have things that are portrait? Yes. So when we get into places, one place that I see Planet Fitness behind the front desk, their screen is actually turned so it's actually in a portrait orientation. So nothing says how it has to be. As you go through and you start to work with it, that's something that's going to be important that you know as you're working with an organization. How are they actually orientating the screens that you're going to be presenting on? If you're going in and you're doing a kiosk design, what is going to be the orientation of the screen with it? Are we looking at horizontal, i.e. landscape, or we're looking at vertical, portrait? So as we go through, we start to build them. See what starts to happen with the space. How are we able to go through and begin to use the space? The other thing to start to think about as we're working too is what's the difference, or how is something going to go from being a static design, static composition, into something that's more dynamic, meaning that's going to go in there and begin to move. The challenge that we have right now as designers is that whenever we design something that initially is designed for print, it's going to have some sort of digital life. It's almost guaranteed. And that's because if you design a poster with social media and that, whoever you design that poster for, they're most likely going to be taking that poster and putting it on the social media. So now something that you designed just to be a poster has now become a digital design as well. So just keep that in mind as you're working with it. Does that mean that it has to function 100% the same? No, but it should be like 95, 96%. I mean, super high functionality with it as we go in and we start to use it in that other format. That's because, again, overscan images. As we go through and process the image, there's a difference between a JPEG. JPEGs get compressed as opposed to then a full print that isn't compressed and is on the page. But you can see kind of what happens when we start to look at the format here, and we also look at aspect ratios. So what happens when we take the pieces? We can see that we have a traditional rectangle, we move it into a square. We elongate the rectangle both in portrait and then in landscape orientation, and then we move it into a circle. We look at that circle. Where do we see things like that regularly? What do you guys probably use every day?
The computer.
Computer, but where?
Website?
Social media. We go into just about any of those. Instagram, Facebook, whatever the rest of them are everybody's using.
I don't like social media at all the moment looking at it.
Oh, Snapchat, all of them. When they go through and they start looking at what you have for your little profile picture, they're in circles. So how is that going to play into that when you go through? You start designing stuff that's going to go to a company who may end up using that as a profile image. What's going to happen with that on social media? It's going to go into a circle. So think about how that's going to go in and function with that as well. And it's kind of funny if you look at that circle one sideways. It's kind of got you see the smiley face on there. It's got a little brow crease and everything. Yeah. See, I told you guys. I see all kinds of weird stuff when I look at this. They all, probably, if you look at them close enough, you could come up with a face with them. So we go and we start looking at the rule of the midline. As we go through, we start to build everything. How do things relate to that midline? So we're going to go in, we're just going to put that imaginary vertical line right down the center of the piece of paper or the screen. And then as we start to put things onto the page, how do they go in and ultimately interact with that midline? So we have our margins, and then we have the midline. As we start to work with them, how are we using them? Are we looking at our composition? Are we going to keep things consistent? Are they symmetrical? Are they not? We're talking about weighting things. So we go through and we start to look at it. Remember, we're talking about our edge of our page. How much space we put on the edges before we put content becomes those margins. As we go through and we begin to add things, what's happening with the edges? Does stuff go off the edge? Does it not go off the edge? Are you trying to place things and repeat what is there? How can we take all of the things? Is it set up to where it's quick going in there to mirror it? Or are we not? Now, symmetrical and asymmetrical, which one do you think is probably easier to start out with as a designer?
Symmetrical.
Symmetrical. Got something on the left side, it's got the same things going over on the right side. And then you'll begin to work to break things down from there. So we go in, and if we keep thinking about what's happening with our symmetrical design, the easiest way is to do just that. Take something, if you put in an object, you run it over the midline. We start talking about having control. We'll get in later, talk about rule of thirds. As you get started, most of you are going to try to design stuff, and you're going to have most of the stuff working right down the middle. As we design things that has things right down the middle, formal or informal? Formal. So we go through and start to work with it. Anything that you look at that's a formal design, formal invitations, those types of things, everything works off the midline, and it's symmetrical. It sits right down there to where the center of all your text, the center of your objects, and everything runs right down that midline. So as you start designing, again, don't overcomplicate things at the beginning. Use that to your advantage. So we go through and start looking at closed versus open when we start dealing with composition. What we're really looking at is how exactly does our composition ultimately go out and relate to the edges of the format that we're using. So we start building this. As we start to think about the pieces that are there, are the elements in that, are they set to work with the edge? Are they trying to work to keep us inside of it? If we're going in there and we want to keep us in the format, we want to keep us tightly focused to what's going on inside of that. That gives us a closed format or a closed composition. So as we go through and start to think about that, what is the goal? You know, when we start thinking about closed, we're not providing you with directions as to how to ultimately get out of it. Everything is sent. You're stuck with the old washing machine. It just keeps going around in circles. So with that, everything that we're doing, you're going to find that we have maybe hard boundary edges from color. Design's really taken and wants to keep you looking at it, looking at the elements inside as you get to the edge because of the contrast. A lot of times between the stuff that's in the center and your margins helps keep you on the inside of that. If we go through, we start to look then at the ability to go ahead and open up a design. That's when we go in, we start using lines, so we can deal with arrows, things that are going to actually take your eye and help push your eye kind of off the page or allow it to break the confines of that page, that format. Then that would be an open design. The challenges we go through and we start to work with designs. If we have closed designs, essentially think of yourself as being captive. Place somebody in a room that doesn't have any obvious doors, and how many of those people are probably going to stay in there longer? Most of them. If we go through and we mark ways for you to get out of what is there, and we're providing an opportunity for escape, at that point you can leave it. So as you go through and start to work with it, it's not that one is going to be more effective than the other overall. It's just it's easier to keep your audience as a captive audience than it is to actually give them opportunities to leave. So as you go through and start to design that, think about that as you start using those arrows, as you can direct them away, and based upon whatever context in which the design falls, it also opens up to anything outside of there being an element that can ultimately grab their attention as well. As we talked about symmetrical versus asymmetrical, we're still going for balanced designs. It's just with symmetrical, we're going to take that midline and we're going to go ahead and repeat objects on both sides. This is going to provide the most stability. It's also the easiest when we start looking at it from a standpoint of you to understand. And it tends to be, I'll use the word cleaner, because you're really just going in and placing things in the same locations on each side of that midline. Hence the reason why formal, really clean designs carry symmetrical composition to them. We go through, we start looking at asymmetrical composition. In this case, we're going to go in and we're going to begin to arrange objects on the page that actually are going to go in and visually counterbalance each other. And that allows us to go in and start to look at what is there, where are they at. If you go in and work with, again, with that midline, you're going to find that there are similar elements or elements that have the same weight on each side of it. So as I talked before about putting that metaphorical push pin inside of your design, there's enough stuff on both sides of it to actually balance it out to where it's going to sit there nice and level. So we go there, we start to look at it. here's what we start seeing when we go in and begin to deal with symmetrical versus asymmetrical. Essentially, we start looking at what is there on the left. The far left is what kind? Symmetrical.
It's symmetrical.
And
So-
the last two are
Or asymmetrical.
Yes. So when we start looking at it, both of those, the left and the one in the middle, have all the same pieces to it. The one on the right and the one on the left also have the same pieces to it. In this case, what we've gone in and done, essentially, we've gone and sliced the page straight down the middle, and then cut up those other pieces and move them around as we start to work with them on the page. Start to think about what can you do with things, how can this go through and function. When we go through and we start talking about all of the parts, on the other two still make up, if we consider the one on the left, the whole. So we start looking at what's happening with these. What do we notice as we start talking about what the one on the left, how does that feel?
The one on the left is very balanced.
It's very balanced,
But
but with that, as you look at that, is it like comforting feeling,
yes.
has nice harmony to it, right? Everything feels in equilibrium. What do we think when we see the one on the far right?
It's chaotic. It makes you uncomfortable.
Okay, why does it make you uncomfortable?
Because it's not stable. It's like a tower of blocks that's gonna fall down in like a second, and then the blocks are gonna fall off on your fingers.
Right. So we start thinking about it from that standpoint, is that what we have here is also the one on the left has a very essentially static, equilibrium to it, whereas the other pieces feel, because of the cuts and angles and everything, there's movement to it. So as you start to think about the designs, what's happening with it? That one there, we feel like we've caught things in mid-fall. Pieces have fallen down, the rest of them are still coming. That's a snapshot of it, whereas the one on the left is actually very stable. So begin to think about how you choose to place things, how you choose to work with lines, as you start thinking about angles, as you start to think about where their placement of them. All that plays into the standpoint of what is your audience going to feel. We can also go through and we can start to work with designing from a midline out to our edges. So we go through and start to look at what is it that we're doing with that, how are we going through and ultimately making these function. Now this one here is Alexander Isley, and after we get done with chapter 8, we're going to look at a video that's also from Alexander Isley where he talks about his designs. But starting to think about what are you doing with stuff, how are you working with objects, how are you using the midline, how are you using with directions, are you having margins, what are your margins? You can start to see what's happening with the design. Now we go through and we start to look at this design. How are you looking at this one as open or closed?
It's the tile the illusion of a checkered pattern created with the colors in the images, as well as the text and the head in the front, they lend themselves to a closed composition, but the red text that extends outwards, that sort of causing that part seems somewhat open, even though it's parallel to the edges.
Right,
Because
so-
it keeps your eyes off the page.
So as you go through, you start to look at it, as we start working through the elements. In the end, you get drawn both ways with it. So as we can start to look at it, the focal point for this is going to be the head. But yes, we do have text. So as we start to watch the text, what's happening with the text? If you look down here in the lower right, if we do work our way up the page, this is designed to, of course, push us back into it. So as we start to look at it, there are ways that we can enter, and there are ways that we can exit a design. So as we start to think about what we're putting on there, understand, look at, and be able to see, if we pull the text away from this and take away those lines down the bottom, it's very much closed to me, because we're going to be, the head's going to keep us involved in there. Yes, there's those lines that come out away from the head towards the side, but again, they're not drawing focus from there. The focal point still becomes the face. Adding in the text helps draw us out to the edges. But the other thing is you start to look at is, as we get into design, we'll start to talk about how are we moving through the page. So you may start here, you may see him, you may move down the page where it says new, which catches the edge of the format, but then you're drawn to the left, and you hit those other lines that shoot you back into the face. As we start to look at designs, you're going to look at designs differently. No two people necessarily are going to see things exactly the same way. So make sure you work through that as you start to design. See what exactly is going to happen when you have multiple people go in and look at your designs. So as we start to design, whether we're dealing with a TV screen, being digital format or any other digital format, whether we're dealing with an actual flat rectangular static surface, it is a flat surface. It has an X and a Y dimension, so width and height. So as we start to think about that, what can we do with that? Well, we want to go in and we want to begin to work with it to give us that sense of some spatial depth. Now we can do things with spatial depth a lot of different ways. We can go and we can put something in an actual 3D format. So inside of application, we can create that 3D setup, so it gives an X, Y, and Z axis to work off of. The other thing we can also begin to go in and work with is just simply dealing with scale. Along with scale, we can start to deal with placement. So as we go and we start to push things off into the distance, a few things can happen with that. They can get smaller. We can start to think about atmospheric perspective, so we can go in and we can make things a little hazier back there. If we place one object over top of another object, we're naturally going to see those as one object is farther away from us than the other object is. And what we start to get then is we start to build that depth. So we start, when you hear me talk about depth of design, go through and allow us to have those layers, so we can really start to see that we're looking at something that has spatial depth to it, or at least the illusion of spatial depth. So as we go through, we start to look. So we get into here, like we talk about strong diagonal elements begin to move in front. And we start to look at what's happening with those. We bring in those lines. That's power, those points. So even though we're looking at this and we start to see what's there, the other thing we start to get is based upon that rip in the page, and it appears as though the hand has been punched through the paper. As you start to look at colors, what happens with colors? Colors that recede, colors that come forward. So what can you do with the designs to help add that feeling to it? So we get into foreground, middle ground, and background. As we go through and we begin to design these. Objects really close to the page. Don't think that everything has to, of course, be fully in view as you start to design it. Where's that middle ground? Where does that fall inside of this design? What goes down? What's that? Center of the page. So when we think about the midline, if we go ahead and put that imaginary midline right down this, it's going right through what we have listed on here for your middle ground. So as we go through and we start to design things, think about it that way. Look at how we play with the scaling of the trees moving off into the distance. Again, illusion of spatial depth. But as you start to think about it, what are we dealing with? What are the objects we're seeing? Anything that's closest to us, it's going to grab our focus. It's just a natural setup. Another way that they're starting to work off of on this design, or what you're seeing on this page, starts to break into our rule of thirds. So as we start to think about perspective, it's going to allow us to go through and begin to build these elements. So based on this, how many points do we have in perspective? 1. So if we go through and draw it, all of these are coming off to an imaginary horizon line somewhere out here. About here. Pretty much close to above the E in middle. So that's another way we can go through and begin to work with it. So this is a schematic way of drawing into perspective, going in and drawing out your lines as you go in to sketch things. Do you have to sketch out all of your perspective grids and everything? No, you don't have to. Many of the other applications are now incorporating the ability to go in and create a perspective grid and attach things to it. So we'll automatically draw them inside of it. This allows us to go ahead and translate something into a three-dimensional space, or appearance of a three-dimensional space inside of a two-dimensional surface. So we have to start thinking about how are these all going to play back. Of course, when we start dealing with vanishing points, start dealing with perspective. We have multiple points we can work with, 1, 2, 3 point perspectives. So as you go through and begin to use those, what's going to work with it? This is all, again, allows us the opportunity to imitate it. The farther we push that vanishing point off, the larger we can actually have different objects in it. Now, a major way in which we go through and we actually begin working with things is really going in and dealing with contrast. So as we start to think about objects, are there other ways, so we jump back, are there other ways that we can go through and create the whole setup of what's foreground, middle ground, background, or other ways that we can go in and create that you can think of? Talked about overlapping, talked about atmospheric perspective. So as we go through and we start to work with the layering, are we seeing through objects? And if we are seeing through objects, what are we seeing more of? So start thinking about transparency elements as well. As we go through and begin to build objects, another thing we can start to get into, we talked about light and shading, light and dark. So we're talking about drawing methods. Don't be afraid to go through and start to give the representation of volume based upon that gradient ramp that you're going to have on individual surface as well. So there are other ways that we can go through and begin to work as well. But contrast is going to be a major part that we're going to use to differentiate elements inside of a design. So in this, it allows us to go through and begin to think about what is it that we can do with them. So we have our polar contrast here. So what is that we want to go in and begin to build or work with? You know, big and small. So big objects, smaller objects. So go in and start to work with scaling. Things that are sharp, things that are rounded. How can we go through and start to work with those impacting each other? Long and short. So really when we start getting into long and short, even when we start working with text, you can start to play with, you know, tall text versus shorter text. Extending out the tracking versus keeping things tighter. Light and heavy. So going in and choosing, you know, a really heavy typeface and then an elegant type. Things that are straight, things that are curved, hard and soft. And then also we have a lot of stuff versus little bit of stuff. Now we go and we start talking about the Gestalt concept grouping. So with that, we start to see objects that are near one another, we believe are related to one another. So we go through and work with it. If I filled that half of the class with students, and I filled this half of the class with students, and somebody looked inside the door, they would assume, based upon the grouping, close contact with one another, sharing a space, that you guys are in here doing the exact same class when half the class could be doing their own online stuff, another class could actually be listening. So we still go through and start to look at them. What are some different ways that we can go through and do that? So we go through and we start looking at alignment. So things that are in a row, in this case, we think are all connected. We have this one object that's outside of it. As we start to look at direction, same type of thing. Directions, repeat. Here's the one that's out. Shape. So if you go through and start to ask people to relate to what they see. I see two triangles and a circle. Orientation. How do you set things on the page that you're seeing them? Now, as we go through to work with these are things that are just being grouped. We're looking at them, naturally going to see them there. Proximity. Placing things close to one another regardless of what they look like. We're going to put them together. We're going to group them. Rhythm, as we go through and start to work our way down through those. Other thing you'll start to see as you play a little bit with shapes and start to work with the mind is if you go through and you look at that rhythm, most of you will naturally, if you follow that line across there and go down, your eye is going to automatically create the missing circle. So you'll see essentially that retinal image of the other circle that's there as you go through and look at it. As we start to look at scale, so grouping these together, you may see that as that circle floating off into the distance. Then we go and we start looking at our visual weight. So these are all things that we can go through and start to use as we design things to allow us to see what's there. So when we have it, we have our groupings. We also have the ability then to go in and differentiate something by going in and giving that contrast. So when we go through and we start to look at how are these things working together, we group them, we change one object, that way we've gone in, we've differentiated what it is that is there. We can do this a lot of ways. A lot of times you start seeing things, you'll see people play with color. They have a whole line of things and then change the color of just one object inside of there to, of course, draw focus to it. As we go on, we start to design as well. How are we actually designing things? Are things going to be type-driven, image-driven, or type and image emblems? So with type-driven, the emphasis is on the actual type itself. We're trying to trying to de-emphasize what we have for the imagery that is on there. So as we start to think about what is the type, where is it at, what are the images that are on there, and how is it that we're allowing the type to overtake what is there. Now type can be the only element, but type doesn't have to be the only element on the page. So in this example, you're going to see that there is actual graphic on there that goes in and wraps around some of the characters. However, this is driven by the type itself. If we were to remove even that just little bit of artwork that comes in there, the string and stuff like that, you'd still have something that feels very much the same. Image driven. In this case, we're trying to put the emphasis on the image, and we're trying to de-emphasize what's going on with the text itself. So in this case, we see the image in there. And we start talking about the image, yes, the image also relates to the strokes, the brush strokes that they've placed around the image. And then our text plays a very secondary role to it, which is also, I would say, the reason why they've chosen a nice sans serif typeface, clean, so that way it doesn't distract from what we have for the brush strokes around the image. And then we also have a type image emblem. So in this case, we're really going in and starting to look at how are these things going to ultimately work together. So it's that relationship between what we have as the text and what we have as the image inside of there that allows us to see what is here. In this case, the text is ripped through the umbrella. Now as we go through, we start to work with arranging type and image. What is it you want to go through and use? What is it that you're ultimately trying to say? If we go in and we begin to work with type and image being fused, so you see that on the upper left. So when type and image is fused, they are actually inseparable. So we go through and we start to, if we pull one away, we lose what's going on with it. We go back and think about that type and image emblem. What happens if we remove the text from the umbrella? What do we understand? What happens if we remove the umbrella out of it? What happens with that? So in this case, we're going in and we're dealing with type and image fuse. So you can see the text in there. It's part of the bird. It goes through to define what we have for the bird. Over to the right, we have type runs across the page. As we go through and do that, or across the image, as we go through and start to work with that, we see both of them at the same time. So what's going on here is we're actually assigning them to each other to see the bird, the tweet helps define, the bird defines the tweet defines the bird. So as we go through and we start to see those, we're seeing that image that's there. We go through and we start looking at the type outside of the image. So down below, you'll see that in this case we've decided to build a frame around it. It's not placed over top of it. Therefore, they're actually having their own space. In this case, your text is just off of the confines. And then we have type not touching image. So really what we have between the two, so we look at type outside of the image, we've defined our image, we have our image boundaries. You'll see what we have then as margins away from the image. We're placing the text inside of that margin. Whereas when we start dealing with type not touching image, means that we have the full image, the type is essentially included into the image, but it's not in the image in the sense that they're fused, and it's not running across and touching that way. So it's inside of that. So we see it at this point. Essentially, if you think about it, it's taking the type outside of an image, and we scale that up, then the text is going to be inside of there. As you start to look at these and start to understand what happens with them, it's important to know, do you need to integrate the type or put the type inside of it, or you're allowing them to actually be outside of it. So are they going to share characteristics? So are we choosing type and an image that have similar characteristics, elegance to them, flow to them, or are we going through and are we working with them in contrasting form? We have this nice elegant image, we have this really rigid text that is there. So let's go back to the Anne Frank one. The image, the brush strokes that are all designed there to have that brush feel to it, but then we highly contrast that with this nice, heavy, solid looking sans serif typeface. Another thing we go through, we start to work with type and image. So we start looking at wraparound alignment. You also see this called text wrap, depending on what application you're working in. It'll either say talk about creating a text wrap or create what they consider runaround or wraparound text. There's a few different ways it's going to be termed, so just know that that's what you're looking for. In this case, it goes through and begins to use a shape. In this case, we'll call it a waterfall over there that comes down, and it's using that to create that left margin for that. We have a line on an axis. So in this case, we go through and we start to look at, we can draw a line straight down, goes between the other shapes, and piece aligns to that axis, so that line drawn straight down it. Align with objects, so depending on where you place an object, we're going to align our text, so we're going to give our spacing between the edge of the object and the left edge of our text. We have the center alignment on a vertical axis. So when we go through and we start talking about, again, formal, elegant, that's what you're going to have. Center alignment, vertical axis, right down the midline, symmetrical design to it. And then the intuitive alignment, in this case, we're just going in and placing things as we want them to be. So as you start to think about what's on there, where are you putting stuff, the choice based upon you. So we go through, we start to think about it. Meant, have you meant it? So we go meant it. Meant, look at the midline. Have you considered everything in relation to the midline? We go to our E, the edges. How do things actually relate to what's going around on the edge of your design? And for negative space, negative shapes, consider all the negative space. What's happening as you put the stuff on the page? Don't focus on just the positive stuff. Look at the negative stuff, making sure that you're not seeing anything inside of there. A big thing we get into when we start dealing with like justified text, we talked about this back in typography, is we do justified text, we create rivers. Rivers create a way for us to get out of the composition. So pay attention to the negative space that's in there. T deals with our transitions. So as we go through and start to look at it, how do we actually move between the different graphical elements inside of the design? Remember, we're talking about types and images, but how do we move from type to image, from image back to type? How are we actually going through and look at that? And when we start getting into flow, how is that we're going to ultimately flow through that? So this really goes in, if you meant it, means that you've actually thought about, you meant to place everything where you went in and put it. So questions as we go in and we start to think about composition. We're going to play a lot with it. Don't be afraid to start to think about what's happening with images, placing things inside of text. But the biggest thing that I can say with it is just play with stuff, start to think about how do we enter stuff. Remember, as we go through, there's a function, there's an entry point. Where do we come in at? How do we move through the design? So as you design it, think about that flow. Don't be afraid to take a piece of tracing paper and put it over top of it and draw a line. Give it to somebody else, tracing paper over top of it. How do you read this? What are you reading? Let them draw a line on it. So start to think about those things. And also don't be afraid to go in and really break down your designs, break down what is on the page, and take it and even go into what we'd consider a wireframe. Draw boxes around the designs and then pull that off of it. So tracing paper is a great thing to have as you start to look at your designs, evaluate your designs, and it allows you to ultimately go in and break away from what you're specifically seeing on that page.